joining us for the 15th session. We host these seminars on a weekly basis to help you learn about how to land opportunities in tech. We focus on 4 core areas: product, marketing, sales, and operations. But we've had people that are kind of in tangential roles as well, like sales engineering, for example. And product is a very popular career path for a lot of people because, well, it's pretty lucrative. It's also a pretty interesting cross-functional role where you get to work with a lot of different departments internally, you get to work with customers externally, and obviously people want interesting jobs. So product is something that a lot of folks navigate to. So we're excited to talk to Keisha today. So this is a little bit about how the class or how the seminar is going to go today. This is our agenda. We'll get a quick introduction, which is what we're doing right now. And then we'll hear from Keisha about her and her career trajectory. We'll discuss a little bit more about the specifics of her role. And as always, as we mentioned to our attendees for these events, please do make sure that if you have a question, even in the moment, and you want us to address it at some point, drop it in the chat. We check it constantly, and we will attempt to ask as many questions as possible from our audience here to Keisha. And just before we have Keisha introduce herself in the next minute, for those of you that are new here and it's your first time, again, welcome. We started School16 because we wanted to make technology and tech jobs more accessible to people and actually showcase the type of leadership talent that exists in some of the biggest and best fast-growing tech companies in the world, and actually show that there's no such thing as a traditional career path. In fact, we focus on the 4 core areas that Vadim mentioned specifically because you don't actually have to have a deep technical background to get these roles. And in fact, pretty much every single guest that we've had on these weekly seminars did not come from a coding background. So these roles are more accessible. Of course, many of them are more competitive than others, but more accessible than people tend to think. We also are excited because we have a number of folks here in the room from our summer program. So we actually started beyond these weekly seminars. We launched a 2-month program that lets people dive deeper into some of these topics and learn from experts in sales, marketing, product, and operations, actually apply some of those skills through experiential learning and get a little closer interaction through office hours, through instructors. We're halfway through that program now with 17 amazing students. And we actually just today are announcing the opening of the new cohort applications. If you're interested in that, check it out at school16.co/program. We'll drop the link later as well. But you can read a little bit more about it there and the kind of topics we teach in that program. And also, if you're interested, please do apply. We give preference to people that apply first, kind of first come, first serve, because limited seats in our courses. So apply sooner than later. You can always ask us questions that we'll answer about the program. And we also offer flexible payment terms for people that may be unemployed or have difficulty paying. So don't let that be a barrier for you applying and learning more. That all being said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so that we can hear from Keisha. Yeah, and by the way, folks, there will be a survey at the end. If you complete the survey, we will email you with the recording of the session. Okay, awesome. Let's get started. Quick shout out to Mia, who's on our team, who introduced us to Keisha. We're really excited to hear about your story. Again, we're going to start these like we do most of our sessions, and just want to hear about the story of your career. I know that you, like I said earlier, started off in finance, and I guess a lot of us get into that role. A lot more people, though, get pigeonholed there and can't quite leave, especially the golden handcuffs are real. But you made the leap and left and got into product. So I want to hear about the early part of your career and how you were able to transition to product management, because a lot of people feel like it's almost impossible. If you don't have any tech experience, how do you get into product? So how were you able to do that, Keisha?
Right. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you guys for having me. I'm really glad to talk to this crew today about all things product. So yeah, you're right. A lot of times we'll find that, or when I speak to people, they'll say like, how did you even get into product? Like, I've been trying and I just can't find my way in. So I'd say like there are several ways in. A lot of it comes from transferable skills from other roles potentially, and again depends on kind of what company you go into and kind of what you want to do. But like taking it all the way back. So again, graduated from Bentley. I had a dual major, so I majored in management with a second major in ethics and social responsibility and a minor in sports business because I was definitely going to work for the Celtics, and we see where that landed for me. So once I graduated, I got into a rotational program at John Hancock. So it was a 3-year business analyst rotation. So each year you would switch to a different department, still in a business analyst role, but a different group. So my third rotation, I got a position in our innovation lab, which had just opened up. And my team, while we were there, was selected to work out of Pivotal Labs. So the company or my organization was trying to move from a project-based working style to more product-based. We were also trying to move to the cloud. So we hired Pivotal, one for Pivotal Cloud, their cloud platform, but also they have a consultancy like service. So we hired them to teach us how to build product on their cloud. So my team worked out of their office for about 4 months, and basically the setup was that you paired with one of their employees. So our engineers paired with their engineers, our project manager paired with their product manager, and then because I was the business analyst, they don't really have a nice pair for that. So I just paired with their designer, but because design and product work so closely together, like the 4 of us kind of just all worked together. So that's where we learned, what is product, how to build a product, how to do research, what is iteration, what does that even look like how do you go and find the problems, how do you deliver solutions, how do you prototype, but like the whole shebang. So we did all of that through a real product that we were building for ourselves, but they taught us how to do that. So the nice thing is that in addition to learning like product management, I also learned design because I was pairing with their designer, which I was like, well, this is handy. So came back to Hancock, and our team was then slated to teach the rest of the org like how to build products. So again, I had only been doing it for 4 months, but clearly I was 4 months ahead of everyone else. So that's kind of, you become the expert and you learn how to teach other people how to do these things. So it was, moving along, doing the best that we could in a 150-year-old company, trying to build product. One of the things that while I was at Bentley, I was telling you guys this before, I did a year with City Year in Miami, and I taught 9th graders. And through that, education really, it was important before, but it became like really important to me after. And I wanted to make sure that that was something that I was committing myself to. So I told myself I would spent 10 years in corporate. I was working, again, at that time, I was working in investments, so building investment products for like our quant analysts and our portfolio managers, which is like, that's just a completely different beast. So I said, I'll do that for 10 years. And then, I see a City Year person, woo, nice. So I said I was going to do that for 10 years, like sell my soul, the golden handcuffs, the whole shebang, was going to just do it and then go to education. And I lasted 4.5 years, and I was like, forget this. Like, why am I spending valuable years of my life doing a thing that I don't love when I can do it someplace else? So I happened to, at the time, we also had a contract for Pluralsight, and we had Pluralsight licenses internally. So for those who are not familiar, Pluralsight is an online technology learning platform. So if you want to become an engineer or a designer, or you want to learn blockchain or whatever, we have course content that will teach you that. So we happen to have licenses, and we got tickets to their user conference the first year. Ended up going to the user conference. I was like, I don't really want to go to this thing, like tech conference in Utah. That sounds awful. But I went, and it was actually great. And that's how I landed the job at Pluralsight. I, just struck up conversation with someone who I didn't realize was the manager of the Boston office at the time, struck up conversation, really learned how they did product, and they did product like the way product was supposed to be done. I was like, oh my gosh, like, what is this? So that's how I got the job. And that's really what brought me there, was the combination of really understanding how to do product and the education space, and being able to blend those two things together and not having to feel like I'm selling my soul. And I got paid, really, believe it or not, I got paid like, I don't know, like 25, 30 grand more. So like a lot of times people think like, I have to stay in corporate to make money. Like I made almost 30 grand more moving to a company that nobody ever heard of. So worked out. And
Yeah,
that's where I am now.
that's incredible. Yeah, I think that actually with a company like John Hancock, it's probably harder to negotiate, a higher salary because they have these ranges that they're really strict with. But a smaller company, they're competing for talent,
Right.
so they're more likely to say yes. So that's great. And by the way, you lasted longer than us. We were in finance for 2 years, and we're like, get us.
Yeah, not worth it.
You mentioned something interesting, which is when you started building that relationship with that person in Boston at Pluralsight, you started to understand how product is really supposed to be done. What do you mean by that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's again, we were trying, we just starting out. No one really understood what this whole like product development thing meant. So we were just like kind of tripping over ourselves, just trying to figure it out. Whereas at Pluralsight, they had figured it out. The chief experience officer at the time, Nate Walkingshaw, like if you go and he has a book, like he gets it, and he's written a book about this process called directed discovery, and that's the process that Pluralsight uses to build products. So the like super high level version of the directed discovery is a 3-phase approach. It starts with what we call VOCs, or voice of the customer. So understanding what it is that the customer really needs. And a lot of times people just default to, oh, that means like doing user interviews. And I'm like, yes, and looking at data, doing your own secondary research, trying to find the reasons why people are answering the way that they're answering. So whatever it is that helps you understand the problem, like yes, we call it the voice of the customer, but how do you understand what the problem is? Whatever it takes to do that, that is step one. Again, like this is kind of also like, design thinking. You don't have to go in this order, but like this is how we teach it. So VOC step one. Second step is CPTs, or customer preference testing. So that's really prototyping. Like now I figured out what the problem is, like here's a potential solution. How you test that, you might have to test it live, just depending on what it is. You might be able to get away with prototypes. You might be able to get away with something super scrappy that you just like draw on a piece of paper and say like, hey, how do you feel about this? You can do some card sorting, like whatever it is to help validate your proposal. And so we'll say 80% confidence, and that just means like I'm 80%-ish sure that whatever this thing is that I'm developing is gonna meet the customer's needs most of the way. So once you reach that 80% confidence, you go build the thing, however you build it. And then we have CCTs, or customer confirmation tests. So that means like, did the thing that I delivered, did it actually work? Where is it not working? What is the next thing? What do I iterate on? And then again, you just start back with like, okay, like there's a problem here. Let me start with some VOCs, understand what that problem is, test it, yada, yada. So that's the process that Nate Walkingshaw has really been an advocate for, like kind of just developed that framework, and that's what we use at Pluralsight. So just seeing a process in place for people actually understanding. And when I say to sales is like, hey, like where's this thing? I'm like, hey, it's in CPTs right now. They understand what that means. Like I'll back off, like it's not done yet. So it's more of a company-wide thing where people understand the value of doing customer research. And understanding, let's make sure that we deliver the right thing. We also have a phased approach to releasing a new feature. So it's a 4-phased approach where we have like a very, very small, it's 3 to 4 phases, pre-alpha, alpha, beta, and general release. And really what that means is like we just release it to an incrementally greater amount of people, the more confidence we get that it solved the problem for the smaller group. Now, what does that look like? Again, like it could be your first group could be 10,000 people, because like that's kind of what you need for like any sort of meaningful feedback. You might only release it to 10 people because like that would be the meaningful amount of feedback. So the number of people really varies there based on what it is that you're trying to test. You might have to test it with everyone because that's what your test needs. But again, there's going to be some sort of like gating process to make sure like, okay, if this thing worked, great. If it didn't, like I can quickly roll it back and it didn't impact too many people.
I'm curious about the last thing that you just said. Like, what informs the decision for what the big the appropriate sizes for the sample set, either 10 people or 10,000 people?
Yeah, it kind of depends on the feature, the team, what they're trying to get out of it. Like Are they trying to just understand if people, like navigationally, are people getting it? Are they trying to see if they can change a behavior? And if that behavior is changing, you'll probably need more people for that, just to validate like a lot on a larger scale that behaviors are changing. You know, sometimes, let's see, if it's a feature that not necessarily everyone uses, then we're going to have to say, okay, let's say we have whatever, we'll just call it 1 million users, but only, you know, half of those users actually use this feature. So that already cuts your set to 500,000. From there, maybe we only want to do like 10% of those people. So that's kind of how you go through it. It really depends though on what you're trying to test, you know, and what the outcomes are that you're looking for and how much data you need in order to validate whatever the hypothesis is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And for the telehealth startup guy, Jacob, listening, I don't know if this is sounding a little intimidating, or how do you do this for a tiny startup? But what essentially what you're talking about here is actually a really well-defined process, Keisha, for an iterative rollout of a potential product. And a tiny startup is doing the same thing, prototyping, rolling out to a smaller amount of people, but really trying to find those early adopters who are going to take a chance on a completely unproven product. And that's really a job for a tiny startup that doesn't have the flexibility to have all these processes in place like you do.
Mm-hmm.
Philip asked, I think, a really relevant question. Can you tell us about a time when the CCTs failed to solve the customer's problem, and what the next step looked like to get a successful prototype?
When CCT fails. So I don't know that I personally have had that experience. I'm sure it has happened. I think if that were to happen, there were several things that the team probably didn't do before they got to that. Because CCTs, again, happen after you release the thing. So again, we have multiple phases of release, in addition to the like prototype testing type thing. And again, it kind of depends on what you prototype. Did you do like a Figma or like a InVision, or was it the real thing, or was it a piece of paper? Like, it kind of varies. So I'm not sure that I have an example of when the CCT failed, but I would say what we would likely do in that case is figure out what is the impact of the failure. Like, does that mean like people can't access something, or they, you know, maybe it's just confusing, or there's like a weird roundabout, like what is the impact of that failure? And then what do we do from here? Like, do we have to roll back the feature to whatever the state was before we rolled it out? Do we just figure out what the quick fix is and then push that to production? Again, like pushing to production is a daily event. It could be an hourly event. So many times pushing something out isn't totally the end of the world. But again, if it is going to be a big thing, you want to make sure that you have some plans in place. Like, if this thing doesn't work, like what do we do? But before the big release, we've likely tested it many times before that. So it maybe lessens the likelihood of a big total, like, shocking failure.
And maybe you can then talk about instead, you know, what a successful execution looks like. What are you guys actually measuring? And if you can clarify again what CCT stands for.
Yep, so CCTs are customer confirmation tests. And what we're looking for, so typically the teams will set some sort of success metrics before they even go to release. Like, how are we going to know this thing was successful? If we just release it into the wild, we're not necessarily going to know unless we have some sort of metrics to say, like, this is what we're looking to see. So teams will generally have some sort of metric or indicator, or maybe sometimes they're just looking for a benchmark because this might be the first time they've released and they're not really sure what that metric should be. So they'll either just kind of release it and see what happens, or they'll have like an estimate or some sort of benchmark that they're trying to get to. And if they don't get to that, then it's, again, some sort of research. Why didn't we get to that? Maybe the metric was unrealistic. Maybe the feature didn't perform as well as we had anticipated it would. So that's generally how we prepare for that, is to set some sort of metrics to say whether it's usage or, if it's a daily active thing, like we want to see people using it daily, or over the course of the month, we want to see them there 5 times, or we want to see an increase in monthly active usage from 3 times to 4 times, or whatever it is. So those are generally maybe some of the things that people would be looking through. Click-through rates are another one that teams are potentially interested in. Completion rates on like courses or tests. Are people dropping in the middle of it? Why are they dropping? Is it because the course is too long? Is it because the course wasn't relevant? Is it because they had their question answered in the first 5 minutes, so they didn't need to watch the other 55 minutes? Like, what is that? So it's important to know, one, your customer and that customer behavior in order to then say, okay, it's likely this because of X. And being able to differentiate, because again, we work on the learner facing experience, so anything the learner interacts with, but we don't create the content. Like, that's a different part of our business that creates that content. So if I serve up content that people hate and then they don't come back, like, is that because I created a bad experience or because the content's not good? So we have to be able to kind of distinguish between those things when we're setting our metrics for ourselves.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm sure it depends on, the product and the feature that's being rolled out or tested, but ultimately it sounds like primarily what you're looking for is some kind of engagement outcome. I'm curious though, what's the balance like in a role like this? Because you have a software product, but then you also have a content product. So do you have your hands in both?
Mm-hmm. So I work in our learner org. So we create just the learner facing components of the platform. So the content is created by a different org. And again, like, this is a great question because it's something that we often struggle with. If I create what we call a path, and there are 10 courses in the path, what happens when like 5 of those courses might not be relevant to someone? So then therefore people stop going to the path. Like, does that mean the path was bad or the content was bad? So we have internal metrics specifically for course or like content usage, which would either be like so we have video course content, interactive courses, guides, assessments, all sorts of whatever. So we have metrics that we expect for those, like, satisfaction metrics, view time metrics. So we have all of that, and that's very course or like content specific. And then we'll have like some sort of engagement metrics for the feature, which contains that content. So are people clicking through to the next course in the path? Are people going to the path and just leaving and not watching anything? For our search results, search is another one where like search is the feature, but it's all based on content. So, what is the order in which things are showing up there? That's a search thing. But like, once people actually click on the content, if they jump from that likely means the actual content wasn't good. So it's tricky to separate those two, when for a user, like, the user doesn't care like, oh, I was in a path or I was in a channel. Like, they just care that the course is there or it's not there. So it's a little tricky to separate those two, but we do have metrics internally to track that.
Yeah, this is actually very interesting because, a lot of people get into product for different reasons, but one of those reasons oftentimes is you get to work on a piece of technology, potentially something that's innovative. You get to work with technical teams and designers and the executive suite, but you also have to remember that you're working on a product that's solving a real problem, a business problem. So inherently you do have to develop a really good understanding of that, not only of the customer, but at the actual business problem as well. And there's going to be a lot of overlap in that. I'm curious, just to kind of take a step back a little bit, first of all, was Nate the gentleman that recruited you into Pluralsight?
No, he was not. So he was the manager of the person who recruited me at the time.
Got it. So it sounds like Pluralsight really had it together in terms of how, like, their process for managing product, which a lot of companies do not. Product management as a function is relatively new. And it's still being fleshed out in a lot of organizations. But it sounds like Pluralsight, at the very least, did have a very formal process for that. You were going from your role at John Hancock, where you were basically figuring out as you were going along and teaching people, which I'm sure actually helped you learn really quickly, which is why you became an expert within 4 months. And by the way, a quick note to folks, you don't have to get the proverbial 10,000 hours. You don't have to be in a job for 10 years to get a promotion or to change careers. This is a perfect example of that. But was this a sticking point at all for the folks at Pluralsight, that you didn't have that formal product management training?
I mean, if it was, they still hired me. So no, but I would say now, being on the other side of it and having hired people into Pluralsight, I will say that we do a pretty good job at looking at the total experience of the person, and not just the years of experience. So one of the nice things is that if you look at any of our product job postings, it will not say years of experience, like 8 to 10 years of experience. Like, it won't say that. And that's very deliberate, because we don't believe that like 8 to 10 years of experience means that like you're any better or worse at this job. Like, it could be, it's likely, you know, some correlation, but not necessarily causation there. So I think what we do is try to understand, like, where is this person at, like what skills do they have, not like what titles are on their resume, but like what actual experience does this person have. I think one of the ones that I think of most immediately is someone who came in, we knew they weren't a product manager. They wanted to become one, but they did not have product skills. They did, however, have really deep understanding of the education space and instructional design. And because we're a learning platform, and that specific product that we had would have benefited from someone who did have maybe potentially a deeper experience in instructional design than maybe some of the other product people at the time had. So we hired them and said, hey, we're willing to teach you if you're willing to learn. And they brought in some other skills, you know, just transferable skills, like I mentioned before, that would have assisted them in being a product manager. They didn't necessarily have all of the, you know, the voice of the customer, like they didn't have necessarily all of that language, but they did have skills that we said, hey, we can teach you the rest of the way. Bring us these like instructional designs, these like super juicy other skills that you have. We'll teach you these ones, and like, let's do it. So I think and Pluralsight might be a little like, maybe that's a, you know, a side case or an extreme case, it's Pluralsight, but I would say that we don't necessarily anchor on all the experience of product management that you've had in the past. We look at what experiences have you had in the past and what skills have you gained. And from there, what are we looking for? And can we take on someone who, and some roles you just can't, like you really need someone who like has done it, who knows the thing, and it's like, boom, like let's just go. There are other things where you're like, hey, they bring all these other great skills that we would love to have, and we're totally willing to teach you the other things that you don't know because you bring some stuff that we really love. So I think that's kind of our approach, and that's possibly the same approach that they used when they hired me and said, oh, she only has she's only been doing this a few months. But again, like I also was like kind of trained in it when we went to Pivotal, which is generally not really something that people kind of fall into product, and I like fell into a training on product. So
Interesting. Well, it sounds like maybe, you know, some companies prioritize hiring experienced product managers because they themselves are still figuring out what it means to have an effective product management process.
Right.
Whereas your company obviously had a handle of that. So then, you know, clearly you made a good impression on that person at the conference. Can you just really briefly talk about your experience in getting into that role? I mean, was it relatively easy then for you to get an interview? What was the interview process like?
Yeah, so I do recall that I had a lot of interviews, and I was like, oh my gosh, is this what all product roles are going to be like? So the interview process, it wasn't immediate, I would say. So she was based in Utah, but had been managing the Boston teams, and had mentioned that she comes out to Boston fairly often. Next time she comes out, maybe we can, you know, catch up, grab some dinner, whatever. So it might have been, you know, maybe 2 months or so before she actually came out. And there was some event that her team was going to be presenting, I don't know, some like meetup or something. I don't even remember what it was at this now. But she was going to be there with some members of the team. She's like, hey, it would be great if you came to this event. Like you could meet some of the team. We could, you know, also catch up. So I did go to the event and was able to meet like probably 3 or 4 other products. So I think there was like a designer, 2 PMs, and another manager who was also there. So it was a really great opportunity to just like get some face time with the team. And I think at that event, she was like, so, you know, I'm hiring a PM. Do you know anyone? I was like, oh, I think so. So that I think it was then when the interview process actually started. And then during that time, there was some sort of reorg or something. So she ultimately was never my manager. But she was the one who kind of introduced me and got me in the door, but I still had to go through several rounds of interviews. So I did the, you know, the initial phone screen with the person in HR. And then I had like, it was like a 2-hour block, 30 minutes with 4 team members. So 2 designers and 2 PMs. Then I had another like 2 hours, but like an hour and a half of that was, it was kind of like a case study-ish almost. They gave me a problem or something that they were working on at the time and said like, let's talk through this, like how would you approach it? So we did that, and then I met for 30 minutes with one of the architects, and then I met with another, so not the hiring manager, but his manager. I met with that person for 30 minutes. Then I also met with the hiring, it was a lot. I think in total I had like 8 or 9 interviews with people. I was like, oh my, like seriously, like either give me the job or don't at that point. But yeah, so everyone was really great though. And I think that was the nice part about it, is that people were really friendly, and it wasn't one of those interviews where people are trying to find out what's wrong with you. It's more of like, let's understand who you are. Which is nice. It's not one of the, you know, like the typical finance ones where they like grill you and try and make you look like an idiot in the interviews. Like they were really just trying to understand like who you were and like what do you bring to the table. Again, that could be just like Pluralsight culture. But yeah, so that was essentially the interview process. Just several rounds of like the standard, like tell us who you are, what projects have you worked on, you know, like how do you understand what people need, blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of what that process was like.
Yeah, and I've been through product management interviews just like that. And it actually makes sense. I mean, I know like with finance, they have super days and stuff where you sit there for like 6-8 hours or something and you meet everybody. But especially in product, you're going to be working with all these people most likely. Or at the very least, you're going to be working with somebody in their department. And you kind of have to gel with everybody. So it makes a lot of sense from that perspective. And by the way, you know, you mentioned like it was a few months before she came back to Utah. Probably, I don't know, I'm assuming the actual interview process took at least a few weeks if you had that many conversations.
Yeah, probably at least two weeks, probably more than that, 2 to 3 weeks, I would say maybe.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us, you know, we, especially when we're like ready to get out of a job, when we want to get into another one, we want things to just happen quickly.
Oh yeah.
But you got to understand that, like, for example, that was very much so in the beginning a relationship play. You know, you made it a point to go to that meetup, and you made it a point to interface with those different folks. And then, of course, the opportunity presented itself. But you do have to be okay, even though it's hard, you do have to be okay with investing the time into the process. And clearly you ended up in a place that you're happy with. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
Keisha, you talked about, you know, how at least in Pluralsight, people can sometimes get into this kind of product role if they have interesting background and experiences and skill sets. And now that you even had the opportunity to hire folks as well, I'm curious what types of skills and maybe even traits make someone successful in the role where you over time you see them getting promoted and, you know, getting increases in salary, et cetera. Are there certain characteristics that you're noticing are more successful?
Yeah, so I would say one of the big things is being able to make decisions and make good ones. So using whatever resources and information that you have. So one, just being able to figure out what is the thing that I need to do, and then being able to make a decision. A lot of times people don't want to be the person accountable for making the decision. Like they'll do whatever the work is, but like they don't want the decision to land on them. Like that can't be the case. Like you have to be able to make a decision and stick by it. If it's a bad one, like totally own it and say, yeah, I made a bad decision. I based it on these facts. Clearly one of them was wrong. I will go back and fix it. But like you have to be able to make decisions. Negotiation is another thing that like whether you like it or not, like you kind of have to like pitch your product a little bit sometimes. Maybe you need someone to help you out and, you know, do some work on their end to get your thing done. So that's one, but really that's comes down to communication. Like, can you speak to people? Can you understand what they need and not just come to them with your needs? Figure out how that relationship works. And then just being able to plan and set a good plan, being able to bring people along with your plan is really important. Again, that kind of gets into the whole idea of negotiation and communication. Like you need to be able to say, this is the problem that we're solving. This is why it is a problem and why it's important and why we should solve it now. This is how we're going to get there. Being able to allow other people into that though is very important. If someone says, hey, you know, like I'm totally on board with steps 1 through 4, but step 5 here feels a little weird. Can you maybe explain that to me a little bit, why we're choosing that, and being able to defend your step 5. And if they say, hey, that's like totally wrong because you missed some other fact, being able to adjust and adapt to that and saying, oh, well, thank you for bringing me that additional information that I didn't have before. Thank you for also bringing me this insight and respecting this person's opinion. And maybe their idea is better than yours, and being able to say, hey, like, I'm going to go with whatever the best opinion or the best idea is here. It doesn't always have to be mine. So being flexible, being collaborative in that space, being able to make decisions is really, like, I can't even stress this enough, is so important to be able to make decisions and stand behind them. And then being able to understand what the problem is that you're trying to solve. So if you're not clear on what it is or what the outcomes are or why this is a thing, it's going to be hard to get people on board to that. If I'm like, yeah, we need to add a, you know, like a whole new calculator on the page, and people are like, I'm not really seeing it. Like, why is that? And you're not able to say, well, it's a problem because X, Y, and Z, and I have this research that backs it up. Like, it's going to be a really tough sell. And then if the feature doesn't do well, like, again, why did we put that there if we didn't have the information to back it up? So there, again, a lot of those are soft skills. Like there are some PM roles that do require you to have a more technical background. I personally do not. Like I can do like some like select stars on SQL. Like it's about the extent of my coding. You don't really have to have a technical background. What I will say though, and I'll say this for design as well, is that I like to see PMs who at least understand what they're asking for. If I ask you to put a button on a page, I need to understand that that's very different than if I asked you to like totally overhaul the database so we can get some different information. Like those are not the same thing. And I have to be able to understand what I'm asking my engineers for when I ask them for it. I don't need to understand how many lines of code or what language they're going to use when they do it, or how, like, I don't need to know that. I don't care. Like, that's why they're engineers and I'm not. Like, that's what you do. But being able to understand generally their domain and being able to respect that domain is important, as well as design. Again, like, why you are the designer, so I'm not necessarily always going to question what you did, but understanding what I'm asking you for when I ask you a thing, and being open to some level of pushback. So again, no need to, well, I shouldn't say no need. It's not all the time that you will need a technical background, but having an understanding of generally what you're asking for is helpful.
And, you know, to that end, and I agree with that 100%, a lot to uncover in terms of what you said, because actually, as you were speaking, you know, something that popped into my head is the fact that what you're explaining, the skills that are required to be successful in a product role are actually the same skills that are required to be successful in an entrepreneurial role if you're starting your own business. And one of those is you have to be willing to admit when you're wrong, or admit when you don't know everything, because there's no way that you can know everything. Mm-hmm. So I think that's pretty critical. But something that you touched on right now is having that understanding and insight into the impact of a change, right? On, let's say, the actual product and the work that would have to come into that. How do you develop that skill? I mean, is that just basically on the job? You make some mistakes and you learn, and that's how you get better at it?
Yeah, that's one. You'll make some pretty bad decisions, or you'll piss off a couple engineers when you ask them to do a thing. So you'll learn quickly that way. I think another thing that's been helpful for me, which is something that I learned at Pivotal, was this concept of design dev pairing or product dev pairing. And it's this idea that rather than sitting there and writing out the whole like spec of whatever this feature is supposed to be, or like creating the whole design, sometimes the feature is like kind of fluid and you're not really sure like what the final thing is. You know what you're getting at, but you're not like super sure on it. Or maybe it's something that just like, it's like really kind of minutia, and it's easier to just talk about it than to like have to write out some like super detailed spec. So the idea is that you'll just sit with the engineer and you guys will kind of do it together. So we'll just talk about it and they'll be able to do it in their environment, and we'll quickly be able to make changes and see like, is this what you're going for? Maybe not. Like, okay, is this what you're going for? Yeah, that's more of it. But maybe we can change it in this way, and you'll quickly be able to go through it. And in doing that, the engineer feels like they're able to really contribute to whatever the final outcome is. But you're also starting to understand, like, I just asked him to make this little tweak, but he literally opened like 6 different tabs, had to change like all of these different things. And I was like, whoa, I just like asked you to change that like one little thing. I didn't realize that you had to do like all of these changes in all of these places in order to get that. So like that kind of also helps you understand, like, yeah, it might seem small to like, oh, just change the color on this button, but like maybe it's not that simple. So that's the other way that I think I've learned about, you know, kind of what goes into making some of these changes. And again, just kind of talking about it. If we say like, hey, we're going to put a calculator on this page, they're like, all right, well, like we could do that, but it's going to take, you know, this amount of time. We could instead do this other thing, which will still get you to the outcome that you're looking for, but it's maybe not a calculator. Maybe it's just a text box. Is that fine? And I'm like, actually, yeah, that's great. Like, let's do that instead. So those are generally the ways I try not to make them angry, but it's happened.
Well, but you know what? I think that's actually a great story there, because when you do see the real time, what actually the work that's involved, you definitely appreciate every ask that you make of the engineering team, because you know, with most organizations that are growing, at the very least, there's an endless roadmap and things that they could work on, and of course, it's your job to prioritize it, but it is important to be sensitive to that. And I think absolutely, I mean, that's how I learned as well. Nothing beats having FaceTime with the engineer, because I can't tell you how many times like I'd have my VP or something ask me to put together a spec to send to an engineer, and I would push back and say, I'm going to meet with them and then write the spec, because it's probably going to be wrong completely unless I have that meeting in the first place. And by the way, I mean, if you are willing to learn, if you're actually downloading the information that the engineer is sharing with you, they're going to love talking to you. They're going to actually prefer to talk to you, and you're going to be that person that is then able to negotiate things in the benefit of the company. So I think that's great.
Right.
I think one other thing that you mentioned in this conversation is the successful product manager is someone that can deeply understand the customer's problem and actually is seeking to solve it. And I think when you hear that, it sounds almost like duh, that's so simple, but it's funny how many people miss that. First-time entrepreneurs or first-time people getting into product, they really are focusing on the features and they're in love with the features, where you have to have the discipline to not care about the feature, care more about solving the problem, and have to scrap it all if you absolutely need to. And I think it's a good lead into the question that Jacob had, which is he's the one that's working on a health telehealth product for health systems, and he's wondering where to focus between the customer, the health system itself, or the end user, the patients. The end user is a customer that, you know, the health system may be paying for the product, and they're kind of separate. So which one do you focus on first?
That's a great question. So this is a similar Pluralsight problem, right? Like enterprises will buy the software, but like it's their employees who actually use it. And so who do we listen to? Do we listen to the buyer, or do we listen to the user? So we listen to both, but at the end of the day, like we're here to serve the customer. We call them the customers, but they're really the like learners. yes, there are buyers also that we need to serve, and we do need to deliver, because if they don't like it, they don't buy it, and then therefore their employees or their learners don't get it. But again, because I'm in our learner facing department, like I don't really care what the buyers want. Like there's a whole different department that kind of focuses on them. And we've split our product in a way in which we have teams that are, their priority is the buyer. And then we have my team whose priority is the learner. So I prioritize the learner. I do keep the buyer kind of in the back of my mind, and it's kind of the reverse for our other team. So, I mean, again, it kind of depends. It is important to, your buyer is the first step. So like if they don't love it, they're like your end user is never going to get it in many cases. So if that's the case, then I would say, like, you know, at least make enough of an appeal to that first user, the buyer, to get them to buy, and then really make the final product something that the user, whoever the end person is, like so loves that if the buyer were to take it away, there would be a lot of pushback from the end user. And that's kind of where we're at right now, is that you know, and even when I was at Hancock, when Pluralsight was a resource that we had, they tried to take it away, and the engineers like were like, absolutely not, don't take this thing away from us, like we want it. So again, in that case, like they just kept it because the engineers were like, this thing is so great, like you can't take our learning tool away from us. So in that case, like even though the buyer may have wanted to shift, because the end users you know, allegiance to this tool was so strong, they're like, well, I guess we can't. Or if we do, like the next thing better be just as good or better, or people are going to be really upset. So again, I would say get it to at least a point where the buyer is pretty sold on it, and then the end user like absolutely loves it, to the point where the buyer like can't not give it to the end user.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And, you know, it is obviously a challenge when you're a tiny little startup and you're doing everything yourself, but you do have to run these processes in parallel. They might be separate tests that you're doing. You know, you might be testing things with the buyer, testing pricing with the buyer, and kind of their needs. Like, for example, if you're selling into a certain type of enterprise that has security needs, like that's just something you're going to have to address before the user ever gets to touch your product. But in the end of the day, it does have to bring value to the user, or else the buyer is never going to buy. That makes a lot of sense.
And I think one other point is it's actually a good litmus test for what kind of company you might want to join as either a new or a current product manager, because a lot of companies out there only think about the buyer, the money, and completely ignore the end users, and end up having super crappy products. And there's going to be probably a lot of churn, a lot of frustrated customers and the like. But if they care only about new customers, then you're going to get that experience as well. So that is something you should be gauging, I think, during the interview process, how much they care about the actual product itself. We have about 8 minutes left. So folks, if you have any kind of final questions, do put them into the chat. And Jacob said, thank you. He really appreciates your advice, Keisha, on that. I think that was a really insightful answer as well. But my next question is about the following. You know, I know your current title is Product Operations Manager. So, and I know, you know, a lot of people are interested in operations jobs, because operations can mean anything: sales operations, revenue operations, marketing ops, product ops. So can you talk a little bit about how your role has evolved, and what does product operations manager actually mean?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. So I'll kind of paint the picture here. So the way the org is structured right now is that we have the head of our learner department, and then we have leaders who focus on the verticals. So a vertical is like an area. So our assessment, so like all of our testing is in one vertical, and maybe like our onboarding is in another vertical. And then we have, you know, like gamification is in another vertical. So that's how all the leaders are structured. And then you have me, who focuses on the horizontal. So how do we group these things together into some sort of experience for people? It also requires, it's largely driven by things outside of learner. So I focus on things that hit multiple learner teams across different verticals, or it requires the support of teams outside of our business unit altogether. So maybe our strategy business or our security business, all like just not even part of our learner org. So we just kind of struggled on what this role should be even called, because that's just part of the role. Then part of the role is making sure that our OKRs, if you guys are familiar with that, objectives and key results structure. So making sure our OKRs are in line across our learner business, making sure that we're metrics tracking, making sure if there's a big initiative or like a new customer comes in, it's like, hey, I'm a big customer with a lot of money and I want you to do this thing. And that usually comes to me and says like, can we do this? How do we do it? Who do we need to do it? And then like, let's go do it. So that's what I do. So it's like this weird blend of like overseeing like all the things. It's like a chief of staff role. It's like a product role. It's like kind of all just smashed in there. So they're like, we'll just call it product operations. And I'm like, okay, whatever. So yeah, we kind of just like made up that title. There's nobody else at the company who has this title, or has this role, I should say. It's very uniquely mine. So I kind of just roll with it, and whatever happens that day happens.
That's good. And then for your next gig, you can use both that title and the role and mold it in whatever way you want.
Exactly.
Which is great. Gerald had a question, which is it common for PMs to go back to grad school? And are there any kind of programs, whether it's grad school or other types of programs, that are suitable for the role? And maybe if I'll add a little bit more color to it, like are there programs that actually make somebody more marketable for a potential job and product?
Yeah, so I know for like project managers, there's the concept of the PMP, the project management professional, I think is what that stands for, something, that certification. There's no real like product management equivalent to that. I know that grad school, so it's a bit challenging to find grad school programs for product management. To your point before, like product is kind of new, so there's not really, I would say, like a grad school program. There's like master's degrees in project management. I wouldn't recommend doing that. There are, so like Bentley has the human factors in design, which is I've heard that's a pretty good, it's like a certificate course. It's not like I don't think it's actually it might be a master's program. I don't remember. But Bentley has a human factors in design course, which covers a lot of, it sounds designy, but it does cover a lot of this product management stuff. Again, I personally would not recommend you go back to grad school for this. It's what people look for is largely more of the hard skills, not like I have my master's in blah, blah, blah. Like you're likely not going to find your master's in product management. Maybe there is one, but like I haven't heard of it. Even if there were one, I personally would not recommend that you do it, just because people largely look for the actual experience that you have and not a degree in this particular field. Again, project management is, again, this is kind of different, but project management is another one where I see people go back to school for, and I'm like, do not do it, simply because the degree is largely in this industry less valuable than the experience. So I know if you're like an accountant and you got your CPA, like your CPA is going to get you in the door. It's not going to be like, well, I've been working on people's taxes for, like, no one cares. Like, are you a CPA or are you not? That's not the case in product. Like, did you have skills or do you not? Like that's kind of it. So I wouldn't recommend going to grad school for this. If there's like some other thing in grad school that you want to go to school for, like great, like I'd probably go to grad school and get my master's in education, just because like that's a thing that's interesting, but I wouldn't do that to like help bolster my career in like, that's just, I wouldn't recommend doing that.
Yeah, I agree with you with that as well. But also, you take the cue from the person that joined Pluralsight that didn't have product experience, but had education, deep education experience. If you're that accountant that has your CPA, but hates accounting now because you don't want to do, I don't know, inventory management, for example, you can probably find an accounting product or a financial services product that is willing to take a chance on you because you have deep domain expertise with that.
Yes, and General Assembly, I will say GA has some good courses as well. So if you want to do like a boot camp, like I'd probably recommend more of like the boot camp type style or like crash coursey type thing as an alternative. If you want to go that route, that I would recommend that just to get like at least some of the terminology down and understanding like what people are talking about when they talk about like, you know, human-centered design thinking, like that type of stuff. But I would not recommend going to grad school.
Great. So save your money unless the grad school degree is going to guarantee you
Right.
a huge bump in
Like
salary.
don't get your MBA thinking it's going to get you a product. Like don't do it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this was really valuable, Keisha. We really appreciate you spending the hour with us and sharing about your background. I think a really unique story of how you got into product, but also you guys have a really cool process in the organization for how you actually run it. And even for me, I learned a lot about what a good way to structure it is. So really appreciate your time. Really appreciate you sharing your story and your insight. For everybody that joined today, thanks for coming to this seminar. If you can, Vadim is going to drop a couple links here. We have the recording for this seminar that we're going to share with anybody that fills out this survey. But even if you don't need the recording, it really helps us continue to improve these sessions and make sure that we bring in great folks like Keisha, but also ask the right questions. So please take 1 minute to fill out this survey. And also, if you're interested in that program that I mentioned in the beginning of the session, where we just opened applications, we'd love to hear from you. So please go to that link that Vadim just sent and apply. Keisha, thanks so much again for spending the hour. It was really great to meet you.
Thank you guys. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks all, and we'll see you next Wednesday.
Thanks, everybody.
Great.
Thanks, Keisha.
Bye.
Bye.
I always do the wave too.